In a land where dust covers every promise, only one thing never fades: the gunshot in memory. It lives in the boards of a saloon floor and the rim of a cheap glass. It rides on wind so dry it turns words into sand. And on Thursday, March 3rd, 1892, at 9:17 p.m., that memory walked into Rustwater Hollow wearing the face of an old stagecoach driver named Gideon Hale. They had him tied to a chair in the middle of the Copper Jackal Saloon, rawhide biting his wrists, rope cinched tight across his chest so he could not twist, and a double-barrel shotgun pressed so hard into his cheek it left a pale mark. The men around him laughed like the night belonged to them, because in Rustwater Hollow, an old man was something you humiliated in public to prove you were still young. They did not know the man they were mocking had once stepped out of standoffs that swallowed faster men. They did not know he had spent years learning the kind of stillness that makes violent people uneasy, and they did not know what waited under the driver's seat of his stagecoach outside, wrapped in oilcloth heavy as judgment, a Colt dragoon he had promised himself he would never touch again. Gideon did not beg. He did not glare. He did not even look at the gun. He kept his eyes level and his breathing slow, and with a calm that made the room feel smaller, he scraped his thumbnail along the edge of a card table, as if the only urgent matter left in the world was a splinter in the wood. 14 people witnessed it, and all 14 held their breath without meaning to. The bartender froze mid-pour. Amber liquor caught at the lip of the bottle. A piano player lifted his hands from the keys and never set them down again. Smoke hung under the low ceiling like a dirty curtain that refused to move. Then a match struck upstairs on the balcony, one sharp click, then another, steady and measured, not nerves, not haste, the sound of someone counting. The Copper Jackal did what it always did when power entered the room. It obeyed before the order was even spoken. The man who stepped into the balcony light was Silas Varrick, the one who owned Rustwater Hollow the way a drought owns a field. He wore a dark coat that drank lamp glow and boots too clean for a town built from dust. He did not need a raised voice. He had built a world where silence answered him first. Silas took the stairs one step at a time, letting each footfall land like a verdict. He stopped 3 paces from Gideon and smiled as if greeting an old friend he had waited years to bury. He set a single object on the table beside Gideon's bound hands, gently, almost lovingly, like a card placed in a game already decided. It was a smoked silver dollar, blackened at the edge as if it had once survived a fire, punched clean through with 3 neat holes in a straight line. In one hole, gray grave clay still clung, fresh enough to stain a fingertip. Silas tapped the coin once. The sound was small, but it rang in the Copper Jackal like a bell. He leaned close and spoke as if only Gideon could hear, but the room heard anyway because fear makes ears sharp. He said Gideon was supposed to stay dead. Gideon finally lifted his eyes. They were not angry, not pleading, not afraid. They were the eyes of a man reading a sentence he already knew by heart. He answered with one quiet line that made every iron wolf's finger tighten on a trigger. He told Silas to step back. He told him he was standing in the wrong place. Rustwater Hollow sat on the edge of nowhere, a scratch of buildings nailed to a strip of hard earth where the wind never ran out of breath. By day, dust rolled down the street like water, coating signs, hats, eyelashes, and hope. By night, lanterns turned the street into a tunnel of long shadows that made even honest men look like thieves. The law lived there in a small brick office with a star nailed above the door, but the star had become decoration, and everyone knew it. The real law wore a different badge, a wolf head stamped on leather, carried by Silas Varrick's men, the Iron Wolves. Silas had ridden into town 7 years earlier with a dozen hungry riders and a smile that never warmed his eyes. He called what he did business. He called his cut a protection fee. Protection from what was never said out loud, because everyone understood the answer. From him. He taxed every bottle poured, every horse sold, every crate unloaded from the train, every poker pot, every whisper that sounded like it might become a plan. If a man paid, he lived uneasy but alive. If a man refused, he became an example. And examples traveled faster than mercy in a place like Rustwater Hollow. Over time, the town learned the rules Silas liked most. Keep your head down. Laugh when his men joke. Do not look too long at what is carried out behind the saloon. Do not ask why the cemetery grows. Do not trust the sheriff to save you. The sheriff was Amos Grady, a man with tired eyes and a badge that felt heavier every year. He had worn it long enough to know what weakness tastes like, and he hated the taste, but he had learned to swallow it because swallowing was how he kept his breathing. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. The town told itself the same lie. Gideon Hale had lived most of his life without belonging to any one town. He had belonged to roads, and roads have no patience for excuses. He drove stagecoaches because stagecoaches do not ask what a man used to be. They only ask if he can keep horses steady and wheels on the track. Gideon had made a career out of being ordinary. He kept his voice low. He kept his eyes moving. He kept his hands busy. He let strangers see a withered driver with weathered skin and an old limp, and he never corrected them. It was easier to be underestimated. It was safer for him and for anyone unfortunate enough to stand near him when the past came sniffing. The smoked silver dollar had followed him through the years, a reminder that there are fires you survive and fires you carry. He had earned that coin the night a job went wrong and men died because he was faster than mercy. He kept it not as a trophy, but as a warning. When he stopped driving guns and started driving mail, he told himself he was done with the old echo. He told himself he could outrun it. He told himself he could bury it under miles the way a desert buries footprints overnight. But the West does not forget a name once it has tasted blood around it. And regret has a way of tracking a man more faithfully than any bounty hunter. There was one other thing Gideon had been trying to outrun, a promise he never kept, a child he left behind. Her name had been Mara, and he had not said it out loud in so long the shape of it felt unfamiliar on his tongue. Years ago, when his life was still loud with violence, Gideon learned he had become a magnet for trouble. He told himself that love was a target, and the only way to protect a target was to remove it. So he did the coward's version of protection. He left. He walked out of a small home and did not look back. He convinced himself the distance would save her. He convinced himself she would be safer without his shadow. He convinced himself there was nobility in disappearance. He did not admit what was really true, that he was also running from the fear of becoming the reason she died. Mara grew up anyway. She grew up with the kind of strength that comes from having no choice. She learned to read by candlelight. She learned to bind cuts and set broken fingers because Rustwater Hollow did not always have a doctor willing to risk angering Silas. She learned to keep accounts and pour whiskey and speak carefully because careful speech is armor in a town owned by predators. In Rustwater Hollow, people knew her as Mara Quinn because she did not use the name her father gave her. Names mattered there, and she did not want the kind of attention a cursed name could draw. She worked behind the bar at the Copper Jackal because the saloon was where information flowed, and if you wanted to keep a town alive, you needed to know what was coming before it arrived. She was not soft. She was not loud. She was steady. Silas Varrick noticed steadiness the way wolves notice a limp. He noticed Mara because she did not look away. He noticed her because fear did not make her bow, it made her sharper. He also noticed her because he had been watching Gideon's path for weeks. Silas had heard the old stories. the ones whispered by men who survived long enough to exaggerate. He had learned the telltales of a man who used to be dangerous and pretends he is not. He had learned that such men always have one weakness left: a person, a place, a debt they cannot abandon. When Gideon's stagecoach route shifted toward Rustwater Hollow, Silas understood the why before Gideon even crossed the town line. Silas waited until the moment would be most public, most humiliating, most useful. Then he set the trap. Gideon arrived at dusk, intending to keep his visit simple. Drop the mail, take fresh water, leave before midnight. He told himself he was only passing through. He told himself he was not here for her. But he saw Mara in the Copper Jackal the instant he walked in, and the lie cracked like old glass. She was older, taller, harder around the edges, but her eyes were the same eyes he remembered, the kind that asked questions without mercy. Gideon did not approach her. He did not speak her name. He sat where he could see the doors and the balcony and the back corridor, and he kept his hands open and empty. He tried to be invisible. It did not matter. Silas's men had been waiting. They surrounded him, took his gun belt, dragged him into the center of the room, and tied him down for the show. They wanted him to flinch. They wanted him to plead. They wanted the town to learn the lesson again, that resistance is expensive. Gideon refused to give them what they wanted. That refusal was the first thing that made Silas Varrick uneasy. A man who begs is controllable. A man who stays quiet is a question. Silas came down the stairs and put the smoked silver dollar on the table because Silas understood symbols. He understood how a small thing can become a leash. The coin was not just a coin. It was a rumor made metal. It was a reminder that Gideon had once survived a fire and a massacre and walked away carrying his sins. Silas leaned close and spoke about death as if it were a schedule. He told Gideon he should have stayed dead. He told him the town was tired of legends drifting back into its air. He told him tonight the legend would end where everyone could watch. Gideon answered with the line about Silas standing in the wrong place. And for half a heartbeat, the Copper Jackal felt the temperature drop. Silas smiled as if entertained, but his eyes narrowed slightly, the way a man narrows his eyes when he hears a sound that does not belong. He asked Gideon if he had come back for forgiveness. Gideon said nothing. Silas asked if he had come back for the girl behind the bar. Gideon's thumbnail stopped scraping the table. It was the smallest pause, but in that room the pause was a confession. Mara's posture stiffened behind the bar. She stared at Gideon with the dawning recognition of someone seeing a ghost in daylight. Silas noticed her reaction and laughed softly, because the noose had tightened exactly where he wanted. He told Gideon he admired a man who tries to change. He told Gideon it must be exhausting pretending to be harmless. He told Gideon the town did not care about redemption. It cared about power. He said he would ask once, and only once, whether the legend was true. Gideon kept his gaze steady. Silas nodded to the shotgunman and told him to start breaking fingers until Gideon spoke. The shotgunman set the barrels aside and reached for Gideon's hand with eager cruelty. The room flinched. Sheriff Amos Grady was not visible yet, but Gideon could hear what most men could not. The tiny shift of boots near the side door, careful, hesitant. The sheriff was there, lurking like a conscience that had waited too long. Gideon also heard something outside, a faint creak of leather and wood, the stagecoach seat hinge moving under weight. Someone had gone to his coach. Someone had done exactly what he hoped someone would do. Gideon let his shoulders drop a fraction, changing the rope's tension, and when the shotgunman twisted his wrist, Gideon used the pain as leverage. He rocked the chair backward, let it crash, and rolled with the fall. The ropes pulled tight, then snagged on a jagged nail in a floorboard, and with one hard jerk, Gideon tore his wrists free. To the crowd, it looked like luck. To Gideon, it was preparation finally paying interest. He came up on one knee, grabbed the shotgun, and struck the shotgunman hard enough to knock the man's breath away. Gideon did not fire into the room. He did not turn the Copper Jackal into a graveyard. Instead, he snatched the smoked silver dollar from the table and flung it across the saloon. The coin flashed in lamplight, and eyes followed it because symbols are magnets for fear. The coin struck a hanging lantern, glass shattered, oil splashed, flame leapt. Smoke and firelight rolled through the room, breaking sight lines, breaking confidence. In that same instant, a revolver cracked from the side door. The shot did not hit Gideon. It shattered the wooden stair rail near Silas's hand, a warning placed with intention. Sheriff Amos Grady stepped into the doorway with his revolver raised, face pale, badge shining like it finally meant something again. His voice shook, but held. He ordered Silas to drop his weapon. Silas laughed, because he had bought the sheriff's spine years ago. He told Amos to remember who paid for the sheriff's roof. Amos swallowed and said he remembered who buried his brother. Silence snapped tight. The iron wolves shifted, guns rising toward Amos. The town held its breath again. Because that is what towns do when they are about to learn whether courage is real or just a story. Gideon moved low, using a table as cover, and his eyes flicked to Mara behind the bar. She stared back, and the recognition in her face was no longer a question. It was an answer she did not want. Gideon did not speak her name. Not yet. Gunfire broke loose as one of the iron wolves panicked and fired toward Amos. The shot punched into the floor, splintering wood. A scream erupted. Men ducked. Glass shattered. Gideon used the chaos the way he had used the fall, as a key. He surged behind the bar, grabbed Mara's wrist, and pulled her down out of sight. For a second, they were close enough to hear each other breathe. Mara's eyes locked on his. She said, low, like a blade, Gideon. It was not a greeting. It was an accusation. Gideon's throat tightened. He whispered Mara, and the word carried years of absence and a lifetime of regret in one breath. Silas saw the exchange and understood immediately. He barked an order, take her alive. 2 iron wolves rushed the bar. Gideon raised the shotgun and fired into the ceiling beam above the attackers, not to kill, but to drop a curtain of broken wood and dust between them and the bar. The attackers recoiled, coughing, blinking. Gideon pulled Mara through the back corridor, toward the kitchen exit he had already mapped the moment he sat down. The West rewards men who count doors. They burst into the alley behind the saloon. Cold night air hit like water. Boots thundered behind them. Gideon shoved Mara behind the rear wheel of the stagecoach and bent under the driver's seat. His fingers found the hidden latch he had installed years ago. A compartment released and iron slid into his palm. The Colt DRAGOON. Heavy, old, familiar. Like the past returning to claim its debt. Gideon did not savor it. He did not smile. He checked the cylinder with one glance and stepped out from behind the coach. 3 iron wolves spilled into the alley with pistols raised. Gideon fired once, not at flesh, but at the lantern mounted on the wall. The lantern shattered, plunging the alley into deeper shadow. Shots cracked back, punching into wood and metal. Gideon moved with economy, using the coach as cover, firing again to rupture a water barrel so the ground slicked under the attacker's feet. One man slipped and fell hard. Gideon advanced, struck a pistol hand so the weapon clattered away, and drove the dragoon's butt into a jaw. He did not linger. His goal was not slaughter. His goal was space. Mara rose behind the wheel, staring at the dragoon with the horror of realizing the stories were real. Gideon told her they did not have time. He pushed her into the driver's seat and climbed beside her, reins snapping, horses lunging forward. The coach burst out of the alley into the main street as iron wolves poured from the Copper Jackal's front doors, firing toward them. Bullets punched the coach's side. A spoke snapped. The coach rocked. Mara gripped the seat, jaw clenched, eyes forward. Gideon did not flee out of town the way a hunted man would. He drove straight toward the open space near the water trough where the street widened and the sight lines cleared. He chose ground the way a man chooses words, carefully, because he knew Silas liked corners and crowds and confusion. Gideon pulled the coach hard behind the trough and yanked Mara down into cover. Water sloshed, splinters flew as bullets hit the trough's wood. Across the street, Sheriff Amos Grady took cover behind a post and fired back, removing one Iron Wolves man from the line with a shot to the shoulder. Silas Varrick stepped into the street last, unhurried, as if chaos belonged to him. He adjusted his hat and surveyed the scene with cold satisfaction. His men formed a loose arc, guns out, confidence returning now that they had open space. Silas's eyes found Gideon behind the trough, then found Mara just a glimpse, and Silas smiled. He called out that this was the part he enjoyed. He said a man can survive many things, but he cannot survive watching his child pay for his sins. Mara's breath hitched. Gideon's eyes stayed on Silas. Gideon called back that Silas had never understood sin. Gideon said Silas only understood hunger. Silas laughed, and his men laughed with him, because laughter is how cowards pretend they are brave. Silas raised his pistol toward the trough. Gideon spoke without shouting. Gideon said Silas wanted a show. Gideon said Silas always needed witnesses to feel real. Silas asked what Gideon had left to offer besides a corpse. Gideon answered that he had Silas's fear. Silas's smile tightened, almost invisible, but Gideon saw it. Silas scoffed that he did not fear old men. Gideon said Silas did not fear old men. Silas feared legends that refused to die. Gideon reached into his coat and pulled out a plain silver dollar worn smooth by years, different from the smoked one. He said every story in the West has a prop. Some men carry a Bible, some carry a badge, some carry a coin that reminds them who they used to be. He said he carried the plain coin because it reminded him who he still wanted to become. Silas sneered and told him to stop talking. Gideon nodded as if agreeing. Then he flipped the plain coin into the air. It spun, catching moonlight, flashing like a tiny sun, and every eye tracked it, because people cannot resist bright motion in darkness. In that heartbeat, Gideon fired the dragoon, not at Silas's chest, but at the pistol in Silas's hand. The shot knocked the weapon free. The gun flew and skidded across dirt. Silas's hand snapped back, surprise breaking his mask for the first time. His men fired in a ragged burst. Bullets tore into the trough, wood splintered, water sprayed. Gideon dropped, rolled, came up on the trough's far edge. Amos fired from across the street, taking down a man who stepped too far forward. Gideon did not spray bullets. He fired with purpose. He shot lamps so shadows shifted. He shot the ground near boots so men stumbled. He broke the Iron Wolf's rhythm the way you break a horse before it throws you. 2 men rushed the trough from the left. Gideon waited until they were close enough to commit, then fired into the trough plank itself, splitting it. Water surged out, slamming into their shins. They slipped, crashed, tangled. Gideon vaulted over the trough, slammed his shoulder into one, kicked the other man's pistol away, and pointed the dragoon at the man's chest. The man froze. Gideon told him to crawl away. The man obeyed. That restraint confused them more than violence ever could. Silas saw the restraint and understood how to use it. He moved not toward Gideon, but toward Mara. Silas had realized Gideon's weapon was not the dragoon. Gideon's weapon was the fact that he would not become a butcher in front of his daughter. Silas lunged, grabbed Mara by the arm, and yanked her up. Mara fought like a woman who had survived years in a predator's town. She swung a piece of iron she had grabbed from the coach, striking Silas's wrist. Silas snarled and struck her backhanded, sending her to her knees, then dragged her up again and shoved her in front of him. He used her as cover. He looked at Gideon with a grin sharpened by cruelty. He told Gideon to choose. He told him to prove whether the legend mattered more than the girl. Mara's face was smeared with dust, but her eyes were clear. She looked at Gideon and shook her head once, small, steady, commanding. Do not become that man again. Gideon's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the force it took to hold back the part of him that wanted to end this the old way. Silas saw the tremor and smiled, believing it meant victory. He whispered into Mara's ear that her father would fail her twice. Gideon spoke quietly, so quiet Silas had to lean in to hear. Gideon said Silas was wrong about one thing. Gideon said he did not come back to protect a helpless child. He came back because the woman Silas was using as a shield had already protected herself for years, and Gideon's job now was to stop Silas from taking credit for her fear. Silas tightened his grip and shifted his stance, trying to keep Mara between them. Gideon's eyes dropped for the briefest instant to Silas's boots. Still too clean. Still confident. A man who believed dirt could not touch him. Then Gideon glanced to the side, toward his stagecoach. Sheriff Amos's gaze flicked the same way, catching what Gideon had noticed earlier. Someone was behind the coach. A kid. A stable boy named Eli Tanner, no older than 15, who had been hiding since the first shots and had watched the sheriff finally stand up, watched Gideon refuse to turn the street into a slaughterhouse, watched Mara keep her head even with a gunfight spilling around her. Eli rose with shaking courage, holding a slingshot like it was the only weapon he could carry without becoming someone he feared. The plain silver coin Gideon had flipped earlier had landed near the coach. Eli had picked it up without understanding why it mattered. Gideon snapped his fingers once, a tiny sound, but in the tension it cut clean. Eli drew back and released. The coin streaked through the night and struck Silas square in the face, hard enough to shock, not enough to kill, just enough to break his control for half a heartbeat. Silas jerked, his grip loosened, Mara ripped free and dropped, rolling away from the line of fire. In that same breath, Gideon fired one shot, clean. It struck Silas in the shoulder and spun him backward. Silas hit the dirt hard, breath knocked out, the smoked silver dollar skittering from his pocket and landing beside his hand like a fallen crown. The iron wolves froze. Their leader was down, their certainty cracked. Sheriff Amos stood taller than he had ever stood, revolver trained, and shouted for them to drop their guns. Some did, stunned by the speed of the reversal. Others tried to run. Townsfolk surged from doorways then, emboldened by the sight of Silas on the ground, and brave hands tackled cowardly backs. The street filled with shouts and heavy breathing, the sound of a town remembering it still had muscle under the fear. Gideon walked toward Silas with the dragoon raised but steady. Silas propped himself on an elbow, snarling, humiliated, pain bright in his eyes. He spat that Gideon could not change what he was. Gideon stopped a few steps away and looked down at Silas the way a man looks at a dying fire, not triumphant, just tired. Gideon said he did not need to change what he had been. He needed to change what he did next. Sheriff Amos arrived and ordered Silas bound for transport, alive. Silas laughed bitterly and promised revenge. Amos answered that maybe he would die for this, but he would rather risk death doing right than live forever doing nothing. Silas's eyes flicked to the smoked silver dollar in the dirt, and he reached for it with trembling fingers. Gideon stepped on it, pinning it down. Silas glared up. Gideon said the coin was not Silas's. It never was. He lifted his boot, picked up the smoked dollar, turned it over in his palm, saw the 3 holes, the soot, the last smear of grave clay. He felt the old echo tug at him, inviting him to finish it the way legends finish. Gideon closed his fist around the coin, then loosened it. He chose not to end the story with a grave. Amos's men hauled Silas up and dragged him toward the jail wagon. The iron wolves who surrendered were disarmed and lined up under guard. The ones who resisted were tackled and pinned. The street that had belonged to Silas began, slowly, to belong to the town again. Mara stood near the trough, rubbing her wrist, breathing steady. Gideon approached her, dragoon lowered. Mara stared at him as if trying to decide whether she hated him more for leaving or for coming back. She asked if it was true, if he was the man in the stories. Gideon did not lie. He said he had been. Mara asked why he left. Gideon's mouth worked like a man trying to speak a language he had forgotten. He said he left because he believed distance could protect her. He said he learned distance only stretches chains, it does not break them. Mara's eyes did not soften. She said she grew up without him. She said she learned to mend wounds and count money and stare down wolves with nothing but steady eyes. She said she stopped waiting for him a long time ago. Gideon nodded, accepting every word like a deserved bruise. He said he was not asking for forgiveness. He said he was only trying to make sure she lived long enough to decide if forgiveness was even possible. Mara looked at the dragoon. She said she did not want that life for him again. Gideon looked at his hands, hands that had held reins for years, hands that had tried to become ordinary. He said neither did he. He walked to the stagecoach, opened the hidden compartment, and placed the Colt dragoon inside with care, as if returning a dangerous animal to its cage. He latched it shut. Then he turned back and held out the smoked silver dollar to Mara. Mara stared at it, then at him. Gideon said the coin was a reminder of what he becomes when he stops caring who gets hurt. He said he wanted it to become a different reminder now, a reminder that a man can arrive late and still choose the right thing before the last bell rings. Mara did not take the smoked coin. Not yet. She looked past it to his eyes and asked what happens now. Gideon glanced toward the jail wagon where Silas was being thrown in, bound and furious. He could already see the problems coming. Friends of Silas, riders from outside, new predators smelling weakness. A town does not heal overnight just because one tyrant falls. Gideon said the sheriff would need help. He said the town would need watchers on the ridges and men willing to ride the road. He said Mara had already held the town together in quiet ways for years, and now it would need louder ways. Mara asked if Gideon would stay. The question landed heavy. Gideon felt the temptation to promise forever, as if forever could erase the past. He also felt the truth, that his name was still a bell that could ring trouble. He said he would stay long enough to see Silas delivered to a place where law still meant something. He said he would stay long enough to help Amos set defenses and teach the town to watch its own roads. He said after that, he did not know. He did not promise what the West would be eager to break. Mara's shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. She said she hated him for leaving. She said she hated that a part of her was relieved he came back. Gideon nodded and said that was fair. He said she did not owe him softness. He said she owed herself honesty. Dawn crept into Rustwater Hollow like a cautious visitor, turning dust pale gold. The Copper Jackal's broken windows caught the first light like scars. Townsfolk began to sweep glass and right tables and gather themselves, moving like people waking from a long fever. Sheriff Amos stood in the street with bruises on his face and a different posture in his spine. For the first time in years, he looked like the badge belonged to him instead of the other way around. Later that morning, Gideon walked to the cemetery on the rise beyond town, where wooden markers leaned and names faded under sun. He held the smoked silver dollar in his palm and thought about the grave clay, thought about all the times he tried to bury the man he used to be. He knelt, pressed the coin into the dirt, then stopped. He pulled it back out. He brushed the clay away with his thumb and put the coin in his pocket. He chose not to leave it in the ground. Not yet. When he returned, the jail wagon was ready to roll with Silas and the Iron Wolves prisoners. Amos had gathered a small escort, men who were tired of being cattle. Mara stood at the hitching rail when Gideon approached. Her face was still hard, but she did not turn away. Gideon said he would ride with the wagon part way to ensure it reached the next post safely. Mara asked if he would return. Gideon said he would. Not because he believed words were magic, but because he was tired of running from the sound of his own life. Mara studied him as if weighing a coin in her mind. Then she reached into her apron and produced the plain silver dollar Eli had used, the one not blackened by fire, not punched by bullets, just worn smooth and ordinary. She pressed it into Gideon's hand. She said this one did not belong to Graves. She said if he was serious about choosing something different, he could start by carrying a different reminder. Gideon closed his fingers around it and nodded. The wagon rolled out under a widening blue sky. Gideon rode alongside for miles, scanning ridges, listening to the land the way he always had. The desert was quiet, but Gideon did not trust quiet. Quiet is where the past hides. When the escort settled into rhythm, Gideon reined in and watched them go until they became small against the horizon. Then he turned back toward Rustwater Hollow. The road shimmered with heat even in early morning. Wind lifted dust, and in that dust, Gideon tasted smoke from last night, fear from last night, and something else too, faint but real, the taste of a town trying to become itself again. He touched the plain coin in his pocket and felt its smooth edge. He thought of the dragoon locked under the seat and the smoked dollar with 3 holes, and Mara's eyes when she said his name. He thought of Silas's promise of revenge and the truth that the West never lets a story end clean. Gideon did not know if a man can change what he is. He only knew a man can change what he does next. He rode back with a steady pace, the pace of someone who had stopped running. And if you ever pass through Rustwater Hollow and you see a plain silver dollar nailed above the Copper Jackal bar, you might wonder why it is there. Some will tell you it is a reminder that the past can walk back into town at any hour. Some will tell you courage is not the first shot, but the shot you refuse when your old self begs for it. Or they may tell you nothing at all, because the West still respects silence. Either way, one question will follow you out into the dust. When the echo of your worst day comes riding back, will you feed it, or will you finally face it and choose something else?